watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
You made a very strong point that, in essence, the city of Jerusalem is sending a message, and that if it does continue to build in the Arab quarters, and it's not about religion, David.
Right.
Everybody knows where the Arab community is and where the Jewish community is. That, in essence, it sends a message not right for the time. I wondered what you were thinking as he said this.
Look, all I could say is that what people don't know, because they're so used to thinking that there's conflict, they don't really realize that actually, apart from the public rhetoric, there has been progress, that the Palestinian side knows that the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, Gilo, Ramot, are all going to be Israel. Right. Their maps reflect it. They have one issue on this place called Har Choma, but of the other 12 neighborhoods, it's not an issue. All they need now is to hear the Jewish side say the same thing, which is we're not out to create Jewish enclaves in the middle of Arab neighborhoods.
He couldn't say it. Why?
I don't know. I mean, I don't. He might not believe it. He may feel politically it's not wise. It might be he doesn't believe it, and he is politically unwise. It's hard for me to read the man's mind. All I could say is this was an opportunity, in my view, to really clarify. And then I think what he would find is that Merkel and Sarkozy and all these people would look differently at Gilo if he would just say, I'm not building Jewish enclaves in the middle of Arab neighborhoods. That is the key to this whole thing. And if you can't do that, then don't be surprised when it comes at you in a confrontational way. So, I thought I'd try to give him that opportunity.
We met last time at AIPAC.
Yeah.
You were in a panel with Barry Rubin. Mm-hmm. I thought you were the more optimistic about what the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring was about, and that you felt that there was less probability than Barry did that the Muslim Brotherhood would gain some kind of foothold. Whether you were or not, I don't care. What I do want to know is, as you look at developments since that AIPAC conference, and you see what happened to the Israeli embassy in Cairo, and you see all the kinds of things that seem to undermine now the relationship. I want to know now, David Makovsky, what do you think has happened here, and are you more worried as we meet together in November than you were in May?
Look, I think in May I was also concerned. I don't remember being an optimist. What I think I said was we should be hopeful, but as we're hopeful, we should be watchful. And I've said that in interviews on NPR, on hour-long talk shows, where I feel sometimes like a skunk at a garden party, where I said, it's one in the Middle East, what we've seen is that democratic revolutions get hijacked. We saw it in Tehran in 1979, and we saw it in Lebanon after 2005. What we in America think is linear progression isn't linear, that there are forces who want to hijack this revolution and take in a very different direction. That's what's happened in Iran. That's what happened in Lebanon. And my fear then and my fear today is that the Brotherhood and some of their Salafist allies, who are even more extreme than them, I should say, that they are going to do well in these elections. And maybe they don't get an outright majority because they're not looking. Frankly, they rather have influence without responsibility. They see that the foreign currency reserves have nosedived. They've lost half of their currency reserves in the last, since January, according to the World Bank. So I'm concerned that the Brotherhood doesn't want to have the responsibility. They don't want 100% of the power. They just want to be able to guide things without being responsible for the bad economic outcomes. And I'm concerned about that, and I'm concerned, what that means for Israel too, because I think it's one of 5 clocks that are ticking against Israel right now. It's ticking against peace. One is this clock, the fear that the most radical movements in the Middle East exploit the paralysis of this conflict, and they play off it. Look at Erdogan in Turkey. Look how he's exploited this conflict for domestic political advantage and to assert a regional primacy at a time of a vacuum of Arab leadership in the region. So, and you think the Brotherhood isn't going to do the same thing? And you think these other groups are not going to do the same thing? So these are one of the key clocks that are ticking against Israel. The second one is clearly a greater international ostracism. If indeed the Arab Spring, one of its legacies is more nonviolence, then frankly, if there's no progress, the world will have less patience. We'll say, wait a second, when there were suicide bombings, we got it. But when there's not suicide bombings, and here too, there's no problem. I'm worried about that, and I would hate to see, and when I use this word, doesn't mean obviously I agree with it. I find it a despicable comparison, but I worry about South African-like sanctions, economic sanctions. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe in a year, 2 years, 5 years, 6 years, but I worry about that trend line. Then there's demographics. Then there's the radicalization effort that if Abbas and Fayyad are discredited, who comes? As you know, my view, it's not the Hadassah women of Brooklyn, it's Hamas. And then even the trajectory of this technology, that they have more precision-guided weaponry, the non-state actors like Hamas, that they can be able to hit Netanyahu's bedroom within a couple of years. Now, hopefully Israel will, have jamming in the Iron Dome and all these things. But when you put these 5 clocks together, the Arab Spring radicalism, the ostracism internationally, the demographic clock ticking against Israel, because Israel wants to be a Jewish state, a majority Jews, not 51% or 52%, but 80%. Then when you worry about the like I said, the discrediting of the Palestinian leadership, which will radicalize them, and the technology, you add those 5 clocks. Those are dangerous. Now, I'm not saying the onus is only on Israel. It also ticks against the moderate Palestinians too, obviously. You add all that together, it's worrisome, and if you care, you have to be worried. So, I just think that we need to be very wary of where we're at, and be very clear that their stakes are very high. People say, you hunker down in a hurricane. You go to a cellar in a hurricane. I agree. You hunker down and go to the cellar in a hurricane. But what if the hurricane is not short-term? Can you live in a cellar? You can hunker down in a cellar, but you can't live there. So if this is a short-term blip, you could hunker down and just wait for it to pass. But if, as I fear, that this is not a short-term thing, and that the radical forces get energy out of the stalemate, this thing's going to keep going, and you can't live in a cellar. That's Israel's dilemma.
And then what do you do instead?
I think you have to navigate a strategy, and that is to say, look, when it comes to security, tough as nails. I've always said, is a tough neighborhood. The lion lies down with the lamb. Israel's got to be the lion for a long time. And on the border issues, they've got to be tougher now because of the uncertainty about Egypt and Jordan and where they're going to be in 5 years. But the idea of negotiations is something that is in your interest to do, because you want to make sure that not the worst people come to power in this very turbulent region. So the problem here, the fundamental problem, is that when you're in the organized Jewish community and you say, let's just sit and talk, it's so obvious. But when you leave the organized Jewish community, what happens is, and I say this with a lot of sadness, what I'm about to say, when you leave that, there is a perception, maybe unfair, completely unfair, but the perception is too often Israel wants to play out the clock. And that means sitting and talking doesn't solve the problem. So what Israel says, what's Abbas's fault? He's not talking. Abbas said, I'm willing to sit and talk with them. I just don't want them to build settlements while I'm talking to them. When they thought it was Sharon and Barak and Peres and Rabin, who were right after the Rabin anniversary, they thought Israel wanted a deal. So, of course, you sit and talk. You're talking to make a deal. But if they don't think you want a deal, then they're going to look at it very differently.
They don't believe Netanyahu wants to deal.
Yeah, the problem is Netanyahu lost two people who came in wanting to believe him. One, his name is Angela Merkel, and one, his name is Nicolas Sarkozy. He lost them, and we've gotten to the point that Obama has had to defend Netanyahu in conversations with them because they lost faith. And this is really serious. And the American Jewish community has no idea what's going on.
You know, by the way, you get better and better. I mean it. And, you know, we look to you for insight, and you always have it.
Well, we shouldn't give up. We shouldn't give up. We shouldn't give up on Israel. We shouldn't give up on peace. And we shouldn't give up.
Kol tuv hatzlacha to you.
Okay.
And soon I'll get you in the studio. We'll sit and talk, and I'll answer all my questions. Thanks for giving us a moment. David Makovsky.
Thank you, Mark.